some people will think multi-cloud only means when you're leveraging 2 or 3 or more of the big cloud providers. But of course, in our experience at AppNeta, because we see through the network and we experience the end-to-end network the same way your applications do, multi-cloud actually takes on a lot of different meanings. And it's kind of exciting because you might think you're working with a SaaS provider and it's only that SaaS provider's infrastructure and or network that you're concerned about. But behind that SaaS provider, they also could be using additional cloud providers in order to deliver their service to you. So there's many layers to this onion, and multi-cloud starts to get very, very complex. And of course, that's only on the original.
Matt, I want to hear you define multi-cloud for us here, because when I think of multi-cloud, man, what I'm thinking of is I'm using multi-cloud as in I'm an Azure consumer and I'm an AWS consumer. Maybe I'm a Google Cloud consumer as well. And I'm hearing you say some different things for multi-cloud. So how do you guys mean it as AppNeta?
Well, we absolutely agree with your definition, Ethan. It's for sure. If you're, if you're decided you're gonna go with a cloud provider and you've decided that for a given application, Azure is the right place to go and you're going to leverage that. But there could be other dimensions either within that application or an on-ramp to that application. You might decide that for single sign-on, you like a single sign-on provider that's in one cloud provider, but the app hosting infrastructure is in a second provider. That's kind of the classic definition of multi-cloud. We see that all the time. And I think that's probably, right over the plate.
And I think the real pain point around multi-cloud is the fact that you have these systems like each one of those clouds has its own visibility tool. So if you go into Google or AWS, you see Google or AWS give you visibility. Or if you're in your home cloud on your private prem, you get visibility from your own tools. But when you go multi-cloud, all of a sudden there's a big gap in the middle and you don't get visibility into what happens. If you're on Direct Connect or if you're using internet connectivity, or if you're using tunnels over the internet or VPNs or whatever it is, all of a sudden you're in this vacuum of, oh, do you know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, I think there's an element of actually not even knowing or necessarily knowing up front all the dependencies you're going to end up having with successfully delivering an application that is cloud-based or multi-cloud. You're going to end up using single sign-on, like Matt said. You're going to end up using content distribution networks, and getting visibility across all of those disparate pieces, I think, is the challenge. And that's kind of echoing what you're saying, Greg. Yeah.
And that's that gap. That's the coverage gap or the visibility gap or the monitoring gap. Is all of a sudden you've got the system you built for your private cloud, and then you've got a system that you probably got in your public cloud because they've got one, but it's all isolated and it's all a single pane of glass. That's pane with an I, not pane with an I. But they don't join up. They're all isolated and supported separately, and they all do different things and they all have different language. And the big gap in the multi-cloud today remains visibility into those islands. And that's one of the things that AppNeta does. So maybe you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's interesting. You're absolutely right. There's certainly the islands at the point of application hosting. And then you have islands at the other end where the users are. And, the part where the AppNeta approach really resonates with multi-cloud is when you combine work from anywhere, whether it's work from an office, whether it's work from home, when you combine all different types of connectivity options, whether you are going to leverage a corporate network or a corporate managed network like MPLS, maybe you've started to embrace SD-WAN and you're taking advantage of some of the other rollout options of SD-WAN, including direct to internet in conjunction with a corporate managed, and then you add in the final layer of multi-cloud, you start to get this perfect storm of there is no single point of ownership of any element of the delivery network. It's owned by 7 or 8 or sometimes more different entities. Yet you as a consumer running that business critical app to run your business, or more importantly, IT, who's on the hook to support those, where do they go? Who do they point their finger at? And senior IT executives are like, wait a minute, I moved to the cloud because this is supposed to be easier. It's supposed to be more agile. It's supposed to be better. It might save me money, but I want to deliver better service to my constituents. And in fact, the monitoring technologies of the past, which are largely based upon the premise of I have an administrative domain and I have administrative access to that domain, just completely fall apart. You have no administrative.
The mean time to innocence just goes to nowhere. Like, because you've got no, like the network engineer is always his fault because you can never say not. And this is where visibility and monitoring tools are absolutely the foundation of multi-cloud, as far as I'm concerned. And I think one of the things that people don't think about in multi-cloud is you can't plan where you're going. People are going somewhere in the cloud. Sometimes it's Google, sometimes it's the Azure, sometimes it's the AWS, sometimes it's somebody else's cloud, sometimes it's a SaaS service, sometimes it's a computer under somebody's desk for all you know. But you still got, it might just as well be, I don't know. But the point is that if all that happens, how do you get to the point where you can say, not me, it's not the network, it's not my problem, or it is, even more importantly, because one of the really challenging parts about day two ownership is if it is your fault, then you can go straight to fixing it, right? But if you spend 2 days saying, oh, it's not me, and then all of a sudden it's you, that can be a resume generating event. So it's not.
Yeah, it's true. And then also,
sorry, go ahead, John.
You're at the mercy of, just like you're saying, you can't predict how some of this stuff goes. Also, if you subscribe to some of these SaaS providers and then they choose the architecture that they use and they move architectures, and these are things that, were not part of the original design. So ownership keeps going down, accountability keeps going up for the IT team. And you've got to have a way to prove that you're measuring this all the time. When things change, and when they do change, you've got the insight to know whether or not it's something to do with the things that you do control, although that is shrinking, the amount of things that you do have under your control, or if it's happening out on the third-party providers. And some of those times you need to hold those providers accountable. Some of the times those are just events happening on the internet that are outside of your control. But the quicker you can do that, the less time you're wasting. And of course, you've got the ability to be more strategic to the enterprise, because you can say, actually, we have this data. You don't need to ask us whether or not we've got it. We've got it. And we know when it's us.
Where all the networks are owned by a variety of different institutions, probably not us. So we're relying on this network transport that we don't own as network engineers, let's say, if we're coming from that point of view. How do I get to a point where I can pinpoint what the problem is? I don't even own places where I could put a probe in or get a tap or a span or collect flow records. So how do I get to that point where I can see what's going on in this complex delivery network that I'm relying on to get apps to my users?
Well, we've just built a really big firewall, and we just asked the entire internet to run through our firewall, and that way we see everything. One of the things we decided to do.
Genius. Absolute genius.
When we founded the company, we realized that it really begins and ends with the end user experience. I mean, people build networks to support applications and support users, not the other way around. And the problem up to that point with most monitoring approaches, it was based on an infrastructure-centric model, which was, if I touch the infrastructure, I measure the infrastructure, I can pull different pieces together, and I can build a rough approximation of what the network feels like by looking at the infrastructure. And there's certainly elements of that that's still warranted today, although less and less. The AppNeta approach is very different. We simply say, let's live in the network. Let's experience the network. Let's let our customers experience their network. And by experiencing the network, every 60 seconds by default, as frequently as every second for some of our larger customers, we can actually understand end to end by traveling up and down the exact delivery network that the applications transfer. We're gonna see and experience and be able to proactively give IT the visibility from the endpoint where the app is being consumed all the way up to the origination point where it's hosted. And that was the
magic word. Yeah. Okay, Matt, that you said endpoint. That was the magic word that I wanted to hear and understand. So we're doing, as AppNeta, you're doing, so is it a transactional approach or an observational approach? I mean, are you initiating a transaction and observing what comes back, or are you just watching flows?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, we've all experienced technology over the days and technology companies that have a better way, a better mousetrap. And the problem with better mousetraps is you tend to get hung up on the religion behind that and say, this is the best way to do it. And we decided early on, we are not going to get hung up on a single religion. So to your exact question, we use a combination of both active and passive observability. So some dimensions, for example, when you want to just understand, day one, when you start thinking about monitoring your business critical applications, the idea of what the business thinks is the business critical apps being used in Office versus what's actually being used are usually a pretty big gap. And so day one for us is let's just passively discover which apps are being used by which people in which office and what is the impact on the network. Because so often we get brought in by customers and they say, we're running the following sets of applications only to find out it's very different. And of course, the way those apps interact with each other also combines to impact both the end user experience and the impact of the network. That's generally a passive approach where I'm going to look at the flows and the packets and just passively observe what's going on. Then you combine that with active methodology where you will actually send pre-engineered, very controlled traffic patterns up and down the network in order to experience the network the same way the applications do. And it's by combining these two dimensions of both active and passive at the same time. We actually refer to this as 4D monitoring. We affectionately call it path, packet, web, and flow. It's by combining all those together that we think we can cover any app, any location, any destination.
Okay, no religion. You are multi-religious, if you will. You welcome all. Okay, got it. And to be fair, that makes sense, because depending on what it is you're trying to monitor and find out about, observational might be enough. And then there are those times where you're going to want to initiate those tests and see what's going on. Another point there that you made was discovery. You said you are observing the network and figuring out who's talking to whom and what, and then building a database of those conversations, something like that?
That's an option. Yep, customers can keep that. Sometimes we're using that simply as a directional idea. So if, we tend to focus on enterprises that are 5,000 users and above in general tend to use the AppNeta technology, primarily because of the scale and the way our platform works. These kind of large distributed networks become a real challenge, and that's where the platform comes through. But when you get to an organization of that size, and you ask an IT leader, hey, what are you running for CRM? They laugh. Like, well, which 7 CRMs do you want me to talk about? Because over time, that business has used multiple versions of all these different vertical stacks. And so our job is to figure out, maybe the East Coast has a field team that's using one CRM, and the Central is using another. In Europe, they're using a third, because either organic growth or acquisitions. Applications are messy, and the way users use them are messy. So our job is to find out per office, per user, which ones are actually being used. And of course, we then want to quantify what's the end user experience of these business critical apps. If Europe is using CRM A and it's fine, and the West Coast in the US uses that same CRM app and it's not fine, is it a location problem? Is it a deployment problem? Is it something the customer has done to themselves? Is it something the carrier's done in the middle? Is it something the service provider that they happen to not service the West Coast as well as they do Europe? Those are all the dimensions we think are our job, number one, to lay the baseline to IT and say, here are the zones and the administrative areas where we can look at to help you find these and fix these problems.
So there's a practical question I want to ask here. Part of what AppNeta does is this idea of a synthetic transaction. That is, you can create a request. So we were talking about CRMs a minute ago. I can actually go into AppNeta, create a profile which goes and logs into the CRM and does a typical CRM action. And then I can measure how long it takes for us to, I don't know, create an entry in the CRM or to do a follow-up or something, whatever it is. And then I can take that response time and then track it into a database and then present that on a dashboard, right? The question is, if you've never done that before, that can feel daunting. How hard is that? Like, do customers sort of struggle, or because in the old days it was hard, but now I get the sense that it's not as hard as it was.
The answer, it depends. Degree of hardness, the reason I say it depends is we have a lot of pre-built scripts that are out there for customers. They can just log in and use them exactly as we built them for a lot of leading applications. And in that case, the the uptake is next to zero. But the more you want to customize, the more you want to build intelligence in, you can either take our pre-built scripts and modify those, or increasingly, we have a real simple plugin that drops in your browser with a record button. And we say, you know what, if you've got a complex workflow and it's got idiosyncrasies related to your business, don't start with our script. Just hit the record button and go through and do the transactions the way you want, and that will produce the script. And we, the core premise here isn't that the script or the synthetics are going to show the problem. It's going to be part of the solution by establishing the baseline. What we want to use synthetics for is to understand what's normal and to do the exact same step over time, so that if you see deviations from norm, you can understand where the change is, because we all know that one of the problems with monitoring is when you start changing too many variables, you get the people around the team and the fingers start pointing like this.
Yeah.
So,
Wait, I mean, the thing I like about synthetic transactions, because I've been doing synthetic monitoring for 25 years. I started with a system long time ago. And the really great thing about synthetics was that I could do it on the weekend when there was no load, when that was the baseline I wanted, right? And then you could see it come in on Monday morning, and you could see if something changed and that time of day. And then as the system builds up, there was end of month. And then you could start to realize that, if you had an internal system and it started to hit a peak loading thing, my favorite part was to go to the developer and say, you've got a peak load problem on the 31st of the month, because here it is on the 30th and the 31st of every month, when the accounting report goes through or the end of year budgets go through, your system is choking. And he just looks at you and goes like, no, it isn't. And you go, here's the data. He goes, oh, it could be the network, but of course, but those reports give you that. I mean, I've used synthetic transaction monitoring in combination with various, pings and tracer. I think the other tool that we haven't mentioned here, which is important, is you've also got path tooling. So you actually use systems in the network to watch the paths in the internet, in the network. You can actually use trace route type ideas, and you can chart up the paths through the network. So if the paths change, you can actually alert me and then link that to an application problem too, right?
that's absolutely right. And I think you said, Greg, was spot on, which is synthetics in and of themselves are powerful, but they're not enough. And in fact, they can lead you to false positives and false negatives when you're only looking at synthetics. It's using it in conjunction with other dimensions of monitoring that make them powerful, and conversely make active alone also a concern. You really have to combine them both. And John, you can probably explain how we tie our synthetics with our actives automatically.
Yeah, for sure. So, the idea here is that when you create a definition for an application, whether it's to O365 or a CRM or whatever it might be, that the system is really going to try to exercise to the maximum amount to get that visibility, not only the end user experience transaction at the sort of layer 7 level or the application level, but then also automatically create that network level active test at the same time, complementary type of tests like the traceroute capabilities and even DNS type of capabilities. Let's kind of throw as much as we can out of that as possible when you instrument an application, so that you don't have to worry about like, I want this particular test or that particular test. What you really want is the most insight possible against an application. So it's really easy to tell the difference when there's an application issue versus a network issue.
And I just want to break in. We've got an audience question where we want to keep this interactive for folks who are watching along. We mentioned synthetic transactions. We mentioned flows. This question is about APIs, particularly around hybrid cloud. Do you have any API visibility as well?
Yeah, for sure. So in the active part and in the passive part, there's the two main categories of how we would work with APIs and drive visibility APIs. On the one hand, you've got the passive component, which is actually looking at the traffic and determining what the traffic is through application classification. And through that classification, even though it's all classified as something like a CRM, we are also then identifying what all those conversations actually are. Are they HTTP conversations, TCP conversations? Where are they going? Are they going to things like Akamai or other CDNs? So we can identify who the players are, even though we might classify that application all under the banner of one app, like a CRM. We can actually see all the disparate conversations that are occurring as part of that application. So that's the sort of passive part. On the active part, the same theory applies. You want to be able to create an HTTP transaction, which might just be monitoring for a JSON response or something like that, which you could do. But at the same time as doing that, you're still going to get the network level insight in the network layer simultaneously, so that you're never sort of foregoing that insight. It's always combined, and it's always an understanding of what's happening at the application layer, but also what's happening at the network layer.
I think one of the things that our customers really enjoy is that this is an independent, I call it an industry standard performance measurement and benchmark that they're bringing to their vendors, to their partners, to their stakeholders. There's the adage, if you want something done right, you know how to do that. You could potentially patchwork together some information. You can call your carrier. Comcast will always say there's no issue, or thereabouts, wherever your carrier may be. You may go to a trust or a status page for your SaaS app. Oftentimes you don't know that there's an issue until long after it's been discovered and posted about, whereas you're experiencing an issue. So that type of trial and error when it comes to bumping into or stumbling upon from a vendor what that error is, that there is one and that it's being addressed, is very difficult. So I think, Greg, you mentioned earlier, synthetics are great for bringing your own facts. Customers enjoy bringing their own facts, regardless of the vendor, the type of equipment, the type of network it's on.
Yeah. The monitoring has to happen at different places. Packet capture is the ultimate source of truth, but there's so much data in a packet capture that it's almost useless. Trying to drill in and extract signal out of that noise is really very difficult. But if you go to the vendor, your SaaS provider, and say, here I am running synthetic transactions, and here's the response curve. This is your fault, not mine. Right? It doesn't matter how many packet captures you've got, because you're measuring the user experience. And sometimes a packet capture is that, the other person pushes back and you say, well, look, here's the packet capture, or the flow data, or the, whatever it is that you're going to use to respond, whatever. And this is where tools like AppNeta are powerful, because you have the drill in. You can start with synthetics. You can drill down to the next level. You can look at the flow data that's captured. You can look at the path data in the network. You can look at the packet captures if you must. You can call APIs. You can collect, and there's different things that you can do. And eventually you get a view that shows you what you want.